blood and garlic. That's what the VIP room always smelled like when they came in. Most waitresses would fake a stomach bug just to avoid table 7. Not Chloe. She needed the tips too badly to care about the cold, dead-eyed men in $1,000 suits. But tonight was different. Tonight the boss brought his mother. And when the old woman raised trembling, silent hands to a room of men too impatient to understand her, Chloe did the one thing she promised herself she wouldn't do. She got involved. Rain slicked the alleyways outside Il Canto, dragging the smell of overflowing dumpsters and wet asphalt through the kitchen's screen door. Chloe leaned against the stainless steel prep counter, pressing the heel of her hand into her right eye. Her feet throbbed. A blister on her left heel had popped an hour ago, and the cheap fabric of her tights rubbed the raw skin with every step. Table 7 is here. The kitchen went dead silent. The clatter of pans stopped. The head chef, a man who routinely screamed until his face turned purple over slightly overcooked pasta, carefully wiped his hands on his apron and swallowed hard. "Who's taking it?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of its usual bluster. Chloe grabbed her tray. The metal felt cold and absolute against her damp palms. "I am." Table 7 wasn't just a table. It was the private dining room in the back, separated from the main floor by heavy mahogany doors and velvet curtains that trapped the sound. It belonged to Gabriel Costello. He didn't own the restaurant on paper, but he owned the block, the neighborhood, and the men who collected the protection money on Thursdays. Chloe pushed through the swinging doors. The main dining room was a blur of warm, amber light, the murmur of oblivious couples, and the clinking of expensive wine glasses. She bypassed it all, her orthopedic black shoes squeaking faintly on the polished hardwood. She hated serving Costello's crew. They smelled of ozone, expensive leather, and something metallic that she always associated with copper pennies. They didn't look at the staff. They looked through them. She reached the heavy mahogany doors, balanced the tray of ice waters on one hand, and pushed. The air inside the VIP room was immediately thicker. It smelled of heavy cedar cologne and roasted garlic. There were 6 men, all built like brick walls draped in bespoke Italian wool. And then there was Gabriel. He sat at the head of the long table. He didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. There was no slicked-back hair, no loud jewelry. His dark hair was cut ruthlessly short. He looked exhausted. Dark, bruised circles hung under his slate-grey eyes, and he was rubbing his knuckles, scarred and thick, absently against the edge of the table. But tonight there was a disruption in the usual ecosystem of the room. Sitting to Gabriel's immediate right was a woman. She was tiny, swallowed by the high-backed leather chair. Her hair was a stark, pure white, pulled into an immaculate twist at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple charcoal dress and a string of pearls. She smelled faintly of lavender soap and old paper, a jarring contrast to the aggressive testosterone masking the room. Gabriel's mother. Chloe approached the table. Her heart did a slow, heavy thump against her ribs, but her face remained a blank, professional mask. "Just pour the water. Don't make eye contact. Get out." She started at the far end of the table, filling glasses. The men were already talking, their voices low rumbles that vibrated in the floorboards. "Shipment comes in at midnight," a man with a broken nose muttered, barely moving his lips. "Dock 4, any trouble with the union rep?" Gabriel asked. His voice was gravel. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "Nothing we couldn't handle. He understands the new arrangement." Chloe moved to the woman. As she leaned in to pour the water, she caught a glimpse of the older woman's face. The woman wasn't looking at the men. She was looking at the table, her jaw tight, a deep furrow between her brows. Her hands rested on the white linen tablecloth. They were elegant hands, but the joints were swollen with arthritis. Suddenly, the woman's hands moved. She lifted them, fingers forming distinct, sharp shapes in the air, directed at Gabriel. Chloe recognized the shapes immediately. A SL. Where is the bread? You said there would be bread. Gabriel didn't look. He was staring at a file the broken-nosed man had slid across the table. The woman tapped the table sharply with one fingernail. Tap. Tap. Gabriel glanced over, his expression softening just a fraction, a barely perceptible easing of the tight muscles around his mouth. Not now, Ma. We're discussing business. Tony, get the waiter to bring the bread basket. He hadn't understood her. He just guessed based on the context of sitting in a restaurant. The woman sighed, a heavy, silent exhalation. Her hands moved again, faster this time. I don't want the bread anymore. I want a drink. Wine. Gabriel had already turned back to the file. Yeah, Ma, bread's coming. Chloe's hand froze for a microsecond. A drop of condensation fell from the pitcher and hit the white tablecloth, blooming into a small, dark circle. She stared at the damp spot. Don't do it! A voice screamed in her head. Walk away. You are a ghost. Ghosts don't translate for the Mafia. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the older woman's hands, now resting defeated in her lap. Dinner service for Table 7 was always an exercise in controlled panic. Chloe brought out the appetizers, calamari, beef carpaccio, burrata, moving silently around the broad shoulders of men who kept their right hands conspicuously near their waistbands. The atmosphere in the room had settled into a dense, oppressive routine. The men argued in hushed, vicious tones about percentages and territories, and Beatrice, Chloe had heard one of the men mutter her name, sat in a bubble of complete isolation. Chloe understood that bubble. She knew exactly what it looked like from the inside. Her younger brother, Leo, had been deaf. For 18 years, Chloe had been his bridge to a world that was entirely too impatient to slow down for him. She remembered the sheer exhaustion of having to force people to look at him, the rage that spiked in her chest when cashiers or teachers would look at her instead of him, as if he lacked a brain just because he lacked hearing. Leo had died 2 years ago, a drunk driver, a Tuesday afternoon. Since then, Chloe hadn't signed a single word. Her hands felt clumsy, heavy with grief every time she even thought about it. Signing without Leo felt like talking to a ghost. She came back to clear the appetizer plates. Beatrice hadn't touched her food. Clear it, Gabriel said dismissively, waving a hand at his mother's plate. She's not hungry. Order her the veal for the main. She likes the veal. Beatrice's eyes snapped up. Her hands flew into the space between them, the movements sharp and furious. I hate veal. It is rubbery. I want the seafood risotto. She signed it directly into Gabriel's line of sight. Gabriel looked at her hands, his brow furrowing in irritation. He didn't know what she was saying. To him, it was just frantic motion. A distraction. Ma, please, Gabriel said, leaning closer to her, over-enunciating his words as if she were hard of hearing rather than profoundly deaf. I'm working. Eat the veal. It's good here. He turned away. Beatrice's hands dropped. She looked at the blank white wall across the room. The fight drained out of her posture, leaving her looking small, old, and terribly tired. The isolation radiating from her was a physical pressure in the room, thicker than the garlic or the cologne. It was the same look Leo used to get when they were at a family gathering, and everyone was laughing at a joke he didn't catch, and they just waved him off with a, "Never mind, it's not important." It's not important. Chloe felt a hot, prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Her grip on the stack of dirty porcelain plates tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her blister stung violently. The air conditioning hummed a low, rattling tune. She stacked the last plate. She needed to walk away. She had $70 in her checking account. She needed this job. She needed to survive. One of the lieutenants, a massive guy with a neck tattoo, laughed loudly at something Gabriel said, drowning out the ambient noise of the restaurant outside. Beatrice flinched slightly at the vibration of the laugh hitting the table, but she didn't look over. She brought a hand up and rubbed her chest, a self-soothing gesture. Chloe stood at the head of the table. Gabriel was looking up at her now, waiting for her to leave so they could continue talking about something illegal. His grey eyes were flat, devoid of any warmth. He looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture that's slightly in the way. "Is there a problem?" Gabriel asked. His voice was quiet, but it commanded the immediate attention of every man in the room. The laughter stopped. 5 heads snapped toward Chloe. She looked at Gabriel. Then she looked down at Beatrice. Chloe put the stack of dirty plates down on the serving tray resting on a side stand. The clatter was louder than she intended. She took a breath. The air tasted stale. She stepped directly in front of Beatrice, blocking Gabriel's view of his mother. Beatrice looked up, startled by the sudden physical presence blocking her view of the wall. She blinked, her dark eyes confused. Chloe raised her hands. They felt stiff. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of the men behind her, but from the phantom weight of her brother's memory. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Hello," Chloe signed. Her movements were rusty but clear. "My name is Chloe. The veal here is very rubbery. I agree with you." Beatrice froze. Her mouth parted slightly. For a long, agonizing second, the older woman just stared at Chloe's hands. Behind Chloe, the silence in the room had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of exclusion. It was the sharp, dangerous silence of sudden, unexpected tension. "What are you doing?" Gabriel's voice came from right over Chloe's shoulder. It wasn't loud, but it held a lethal edge. "Step away from her." Chloe didn't turn around. She kept her eyes locked on Beatrice. Beatrice's face suddenly broke into a wide, luminous smile. The years seemed to fall away from her features. She raised her arthritic hands, her movements suddenly energized, desperate to connect. "You know sign." Beatrice signed back rapidly. "Where did you learn?" "My brother," Chloe signed, ignoring the heavy scrape of a chair behind her as someone stood up. He was deaf. "I said, step away." Gabriel's hand clamped down on Chloe's shoulder. His grip was like a vice, heavy and uncompromising. Chloe didn't flinch. She let him hold her shoulder. She finally turned her head to look at him. Up close, the bruised exhaustion around his eyes was even more prominent. There was a raw, coiled violence in his posture, a man ready to eliminate a threat. "She doesn't want the veal," Chloe said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, though her knees felt like water. "She said it's rubbery. She wants the seafood risotto. And she wanted a glass of wine 20 minutes ago, not the bread basket." The men at the table stared at Chloe as if she had just pulled a grenade pin. The guy with the broken nose had his hand halfway inside his jacket. Gabriel stared at her. He didn't look at his men. He didn't look at his mother. He stared directly into Chloe's eyes. His grip on her shoulder didn't loosen, but it didn't tighten either. It was a heavy, evaluating weight. He was searching for something, a grift, a trick, fear. Chloe gave him nothing but a tired, annoyed glare. "If you're going to break my collarbone, do it after I put the order in. The kitchen closes in 20 minutes. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. The silence dragged out. The smell of copper and ozone seemed to thicken. Suddenly, a hand swatted Gabriel's arm. Hard. Gabriel let go of Chloe and looked down. Beatrice was glaring at her son, her hands moving in sharp, angry bursts. Chloe didn't even have to translate out loud, but she did. She said to take your hands off me and let me do my job, and that your manners are atrocious. One of the lieutenants at the far end of the table let out a choked sound. quickly turning it into a cough as Gabriel shot him a lethal glance. Gabriel looked back at his mother. Beatrice was pointing a stern finger at him, then pointing at Chloe, nodding emphatically. Gabriel slowly stood up straight. He looked at Chloe, really looked at her this time. He took in the cheap, scuffed shoes, the stained apron, the tired slump of her shoulders, and the defiant set of her jaw. The flat, dead look in his grey eyes shifted into something dangerously curious. "Risotto," Gabriel said quietly. "What?" Chloe asked, rubbing her shoulder. "She wants the risotto. Get it for her." He paused, his gaze lingering on Chloe's face. "And a glass of the Barolo. For my mother." Chloe nodded once, sharply. She turned back to Beatrice. "Seafood risotto?" Chloe signed. "And wine, coming right up." Beatrice reached out and caught Chloe's wrist. Her skin was dry, papery, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you." Beatrice signed with her free hand. "He is an idiot, but he pays well." Chloe felt a sudden, unexpected bark of a laugh escape her throat. She clamped her mouth shut immediately, terrified of the sound in this room, but it was too late. Gabriel heard it. He didn't smile, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "Is there something funny?" Gabriel asked. Chloe pulled her wrist gently from Beatrice's grasp. She picked up her tray of dirty dishes. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving her limbs feeling heavy and shaky. "No, sir," Chloe said, looking at the floor. "Just an inside joke." She turned and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the VIP room behind. As the door swung shut, clipping the sound off completely, she leaned against the hallway wall and slid down until she was crouching on the floor. She pressed her face into her knees, breathing in the smell of stale grease and floor cleaner. Her hands were shaking violently now. She had just talked back to Gabriel Costello. She had inserted herself into his family dynamic. "You idiot," she thought, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. "You absolute, monumental idiot." When she returned 20 minutes later with the risotto and the Barolo, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The men were still there, still dangerous, but the crushing isolation that had suffocated Beatrice was gone. Every time Chloe entered the room to refill a water glass or clear a plate, Beatrice would catch her eye. They would exchange small, rapid signs. "The risotto is perfect." Beatrice signed, "Don't let them eat your dessert." Chloe signed back, nodding toward the lieutenant eyeing the cannoli. Through it all, Gabriel watched. He stopped reviewing the files. He stopped participating in the hushed conversations about dock workers and union reps. He sat back in his heavy leather chair, swirling a glass of amber liquid, and watched his mother converse in a language he couldn't penetrate. And he watched the waitress who had broken down the wall. When the dinner was finally over, the men stood up, adjusting their jackets, the heavy outlines of their weapons briefly visible. Chloe stood by the door, holding it open, keeping her eyes averted as they filed out. Beatrice paused by the door. She reached out and patted Chloe's cheek. It was a deeply maternal, intimate gesture that made Chloe's breath hitch. "You will be here next Thursday." Beatrice signed. Chloe hesitated. She looked past Beatrice to where Gabriel was standing, watching them. "I don't know." She signed back honestly. Gabriel stepped forward. He towered over both of them. He smelled heavily of the cigar he hadn't yet lit and the cold night air from the hallway draft. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at Chloe. He reached into his inside jacket pocket. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. Instead of a weapon, he pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off $500 bills and held them out to her. "The bill is already paid," Chloe said, her voice tight. "Your associate handled it." This isn't for the bill, Gabriel said. His voice was a low, rough rumble. It's for the translation services. Chloe looked at the money. It was more than she made in 2 weeks. It meant paying the electric bill. It meant fixing the brakes on her ancient Honda. She didn't reach for it. I didn't do it for money, Chloe said, looking away from the cash and up into his grey eyes. I did it because sitting in silence while everyone talks around you is a terrible way to live. Gabriel's hand hovered in the air. For a moment, she thought he might get angry. She had just refused a tip from a man who wasn't used to hearing the word no. Instead, Gabriel slowly lowered his hand. He folded the bills and slid them onto the small hostess stand next to the door. See you next Thursday, Chloe, Gabriel said. He didn't ask if she was working. He didn't ask if she wanted to see him. He stated it as an absolute fact, a universal truth that had just been written into existence. He offered his arm to his mother. Beatrice took it, glancing back at Chloe with a small, satisfied smile, and they walked out into the rainy night. Chloe stood alone in the hallway. She looked down at the 5 crisp $100 bills sitting on the stand. She felt a drop of sweat roll down her spine. The blister on her heel throbbed. She had survived the night. But as she listened to the roar of the black SUVs pulling away from the curb outside, she had the sinking, terrifying realization that her quiet, invisible life was over. By Wednesday night, Chloe's stomach felt like it was digesting ground glass. She had spent the last 6 days trying to convince herself that Table 7 was a fluke. Gabriel Costello was a busy man. He intimidated politicians and ran shipping conglomerates. He didn't obsess over a waitress who talked back to him. But the $500 still sat in a white envelope under her mattress, smelling faintly of cedar and cigar smoke, a quiet, radioactive threat in her tiny studio apartment. Thursday shift started with the smell of scorched onions. The sous chef had come in hungover and burned the base for the French onion soup. The kitchen was a war zone of yelling and thrown spatulas. Chloe tied her apron, her fingers slipping on the cheap cotton strings. Costello's car just pulled up. The warning rippled through the staff like a current. The head chef stopped screaming. Busboys suddenly found reasons to polish the silverware in the far corners of the dining room. Chloe didn't ask to trade sections. She knew no one would take it. She picked up a stack of heavy, starched napkins and walked out to the floor. When she pushed open the mahogany doors of the VIP room, the air pressure shifted. The men were there. The suits, the concealed holsters, the sharp, paranoid eyes. Gabriel sat at the head of the table. He was wearing a charcoal suit today, the tie discarded, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, revealing a thick expanse of bruised-looking skin and a silver chain. He was on a burner phone, his voice a low, mechanical rasp. Beatrice was in her usual chair to his right. When the heavy door clicked shut, she turned. Her face lit up. "You came back," Beatrice signed. Chloe set the napkins down. She kept her posture deferential, mindful of the 5 dangerous men in her peripheral vision. "I work on Thursdays. How are your joints today?" "It rained all morning." Beatrice rubbed her knuckles, pulling a face. "Stiff. Gabriel bought me a new cream. It smells like dead fish." Chloe snorted, a sharp, ungraceful sound. Gabriel snapped the burner phone shut. The plastic casing groaned under the pressure of his grip. He didn't look at his men. He looked directly at Chloe. The room fell into that heavy, oppressive silence again. "What did she say?" Gabriel asked. Chloe picked up a water pitcher. The condensation made it slick. "She said the arthritis cream you bought her smells bad." A muscle twitched in Gabriel's jaw. "It's imported from Switzerland. It costs more than your car." "I take the bus," Chloe said flatly, pouring water into Beatrice's glass. "And it doesn't matter how much it costs if she won't use it because of the smell." One of the lieutenants, a younger guy with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, shifted his weight, his hand dropping casually to his side. Gabriel held up a single finger. The lieutenant froze. Gabriel leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. He stared at Chloe's hands as she poured the next glass. Ask her what she wants instead. Chloe turned to Beatrice. He wants to know what cream you want instead. Beatrice waved a dismissive hand. Tell him I don't want cream. I want him to stop smoking in the house. It settles in the curtains. It gives me a headache. Chloe swallowed hard. Translating complaints about fishy ointment was one thing. Critiquing the domestic habits of a crime boss in front of his subordinates was another. Well? Gabriel prompted. His voice was dangerously soft. Chloe hesitated, her eyes flickering to the scarred lieutenant. She says the smoke from your cigars settles in the curtains at home. It gives her a headache. The silence in the room stretched so thin it threatened to snap and take someone's head off. Gabriel slowly turned his head to look at his mother. Beatrice stared back, utterly unbothered, taking a serene sip of her ice water. Gabriel sighed. It was a heavy, exhausted sound that seemed to age him 10 years. Tell her I'll smoke on the patio. Chloe relayed the message. Beatrice nodded once, satisfied. For the rest of the evening, Chloe was trapped in a bizarre dual reality. She served plates of osso buco and refilled wine glasses, playing the invisible waitress to the crew. But every few minutes, Gabriel would ask her to translate something for his mother. It was never small talk. It was blunt, logistical communication. Tell her the driver is picking her up at 10 tomorrow. Tell her the contractor is coming to fix the roof on Tuesday. It was infuriating. Gabriel didn't look at Beatrice when he spoke. He looked at Chloe. He was using her as an intercom. As she cleared the dessert plates, Chloe finally snapped. Gabriel had just told her to tell Beatrice that a cousin was visiting from Palermo next month. Chloe stopped stacking plates. She looked down at Gabriel. Tell her yourself. The clatter of silverware stopped completely. Gabriel slowly leaned back in his leather chair. The bruised circles under his eyes seemed darker in the dim lighting. I don't speak sign language. Then learn, Chloe said, the words spilling out before her self-preservation instincts could gag her. It's not a secret code. It's a language. She's sitting right next to you. Stop talking to her through me. She expected violence. She expected him to stand up, to flip the table, to have the scarred man drag her out to the alley. Instead, Gabriel just stared at her. His gaze was a physical weight, peeling back the layers of her cheap uniform and exhausted posture. He looked at the stark white knuckle where she gripped the serving tray, the way she forced herself to meet his eyes despite the tremor in her knees. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. Show me, Gabriel commanded. Chloe blinked. What? Show me how to say it. He shifted his chair, finally turning his body to fully face his mother. Show me how to tell her about the cousin. Chloe's throat felt dry. She set the tray down. She stepped between them, feeling the heat radiating off Gabriel's large frame. She broke the sentence down, moving her hands slowly. Cousin? Visiting? Next month. Gabriel watched her hands with the same intense, predatory focus he usually reserved for reviewing extortion files. He raised his hands. They were massive, calloused, scarred across the knuckles from decades of brutal work. His fingers were stiff, lacking the fluid dexterity needed for the language. He tried to copy the sign for cousin, bringing his hand to the side of his head and shaking it slightly. It was clumsy. It was rigid. Beatrice watched him. Her breath hitched. A profound, shattering vulnerability crossed the older woman's face. Yes. Beatrice signed back, her hands trembling. I understand. Gabriel looked at his mother's face, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time all night. He lowered his clumsy, scarred hands. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile, but the crushing, metallic tension in the room fractured, just a little. Sunday morning tasted like cheap instant coffee and tasted like defeat. Chloe sat on the edge of her unmade mattress, staring at the peeling linoleum of her kitchen floor. The radiator clanked violently, doing nothing to cut the damp autumn chill seeping through the single-pane window. A sharp, heavy knock rattled her front door. It wasn't a neighbor knock. It was the kind of knock delivered by someone who didn't care if they broke the wood. Chloe tightened her ratty fleece robe around herself and peered through the peephole. A massive shoulder clad in black leather filled the fisheye lens. It was the guy with the broken nose from Table 7. Her heart did a sickening flip. She grabbed the pepper spray off the counter, a pathetic, useless gesture, and unbolted the door. Broken Nose looked down at her. He didn't look aggressive. He looked intensely uncomfortable, standing in the cramped, mildew-scented hallway of her apartment building. "Boss wants you," he grunted. "I don't work on Sundays," Chloe said, keeping the door chained. "And I don't do house calls." "It's his mother," the man said, shifting his weight. "She won't eat. She locked herself in the sunroom. Boss says to bring you." Chloe stared at him. "He sent a hitman to pick up a translator." "I'm not a hitman. I'm logistics." He scowled. "Just get dressed, please. He's throwing furniture." 40 minutes later, Chloe was stepping out of a black SUV onto a circular gravel driveway that probably cost more than her entire life's earnings. The Costello estate was a sprawling, brutalist fortress of stone and glass hidden behind iron gates in the hills. The front doors were already open. Gabriel stood in the foyer. He was wearing faded jeans and a black t-shirt. Without the armor of his suits, the sheer, dense musculature of his upper body was overwhelming. He looked exhausted, furious, and cornered. "She's in there," Gabriel said, bypassing any greeting. He pointed down a long hallway lined with expensive, emotionless modern art. "She fired the physical therapist this morning and locked the doors." "Why did she fire him?" Chloe asked, dropping her threadbare canvas tote bag on a pristine marble table. "How the hell should I know? I don't speak hands." Gabriel snapped, his voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings. He immediately pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a hard breath. "Just fix it. Ask her what she wants." Chloe walked down the hallway. She found the sunroom. Through the glass, she saw Beatrice sitting in a wicker chair, staring out at an immaculate garden. Chloe knocked on the glass. Beatrice didn't hear it, of course. Chloe knocked harder, creating a vibration. Beatrice turned. When she saw Chloe, the older woman's face crumbled. She stood up, unlocked the glass door, and pulled Chloe inside. The room smelled strongly of eucalyptus and potting soil. "He treats me like a broken table." Beatrice signed, her hands flying furiously the moment the door closed. "He hired a man to pull on my arms. The man smelled like cheap mints, and he yelled in my face as if volume would fix my ears. I told him to stop. He patted my head. So I hit him with a book." Chloe bit the inside of her cheek to stop a hysterical laugh. She turned around. Gabriel was standing on the other side of the glass, watching them with dark, narrowed eyes. He had followed her. Chloe opened the door. "She says the therapist yelled in her face and patronized her. She hit him with a book." Gabriel stared. She assaulted a medical professional? She defended her dignity. Chloe shot back. "You can't just throw strangers at her who don't know how to communicate with deaf people. It's terrifying." Gabriel stepped into the sunroom. The space immediately felt too small. He looked down at his mother, who was glaring up at him with identical, stubborn grey eyes. "Tell her," Gabriel said to Chloe, his voice tight. that I am trying to keep her from ending up in a wheelchair." Chloe signed it. Beatrice's response was sharp and immediate. "She says," Chloe translated, her voice softening, "that she would rather be in a wheelchair than treated like a pet that can't understand its master." Gabriel flinched. It was microscopic, a mere tightening of the tendons in his neck, but Chloe saw it. He looked away from his mother, staring out at the manicured hedges. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the central heating. "I don't know what to do with her," Gabriel confessed to the window. The absolute defeat in his voice was jarring. This was a man who ordered executions and controlled millions, entirely paralyzed by the gap between himself and the woman who raised him. "Everything I do makes it worse." Chloe looked at his broad back. She remembered Leo, locked in his room after a frustrating day at school, throwing his shoes at the wall because no one would just stop and look at him properly. "You have to look at her, Gabriel," Chloe said quietly. She didn't realize she had used his first name until it was out of her mouth. He turned his head. "When you speak to her, even if you're using me to translate, you look at her face," Chloe instructed, stepping back to give them space. "And you need to learn more than just cousin." Gabriel looked down at his mother. Beatrice was watching him, her anger fading into a cautious, weary hope. Gabriel slowly lifted his right hand. He brought his fingers to his chin, then pulled them away in a flat, downward motion. It was clumsy, stiff, and slightly off-center. "Bad." Then he pointed to himself. "I am bad." He had looked it up. He had spent time, somewhere between extortion rackets and managing a criminal empire, trying to learn how to apologize. Beatrice let out a breath that sounded like a sob. She reached out and grabbed his large, scarred hand, pressing it against her cheek. Gabriel closed his eyes. The tension bled out of his shoulders. Chloe backed out of the sunroom, leaving them alone. She stood in the cold, marble hallway, wrapping her arms around herself. She had just witnessed the soft underbelly of a monster. She knew she should run. She knew this was how people got trapped, by finding the humanity in people they should be running from. But as she smelled the faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to Gabriel's jacket draped over a nearby chair, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. The intimacy of the sunroom was a trap. Chloe realized it exactly 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night at Il Canto. She wasn't supposed to be working, but Beatrice had specifically requested her. It wasn't a formal crew dinner. It was just Gabriel, Beatrice, and 2 guards stationed outside the VIP room doors. The atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. Gabriel was drinking scotch. Beatrice was showing Chloe pictures of her garden on a tablet, complaining via sign language about the aphids eating her roses. Chloe was laughing, a real, unforced sound that felt foreign in the heavy mahogany room. Then, the restaurant's ambient hum shattered. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a dull, heavy thud from the main dining room, followed instantly by the high, hysterical shriek of a woman. Gabriel moved with terrifying speed. 1 second he was leaning back with his glass. The next he was on his feet, the scotch glass shattering on the floor. A heavy, matte black handgun materialized in his grip. "Down!" Gabriel barked. Chloe didn't hesitate. Her survival instinct wasn't rooted in mafia shootouts, but in years of living in a terrible neighborhood. She dropped. But Beatrice didn't. Beatrice sat in her heavy leather chair, looking at her tablet, completely oblivious to the chaos erupting 20 feet away. She couldn't hear the screaming. She couldn't hear the heavy boots sprinting toward the VIP doors. The mahogany doors blew open. A man Chloe didn't recognize stood in the doorway, a sawed-off shotgun raised. "Ma!" Gabriel roared. He was fast, but he was on the wrong side of the long table. The man in the doorway racked the shotgun. The mechanical clack was the loudest thing Chloe had ever heard. Chloe didn't think. The phantom memory of Leo stepping off a curb without hearing the truck horn hijacked her nervous system. She lunged from her crouch. She hit Beatrice's chair with her entire body weight, wrapping her arms around the older woman's torso and dragging them both to the floor. The shotgun went off. The sound was a physical pressure that punched the air out of the room. Wood splinters rained down on Chloe's back. The smell of sulfur and burning paper was instant and choking. Before the echo of the blast even faded, 3 sharp, deafening cracks answered from Gabriel's weapon. A heavy body hit the floorboards in the hallway. Then silence. A ringing, terrifying silence, broken only by the distant sounds of panicked patrons scrambling out the front doors of the restaurant. Chloe was pressed flat against the floor, her body covering Beatrice. Her ears were screaming with a high-pitched whine. She smelled spilled scotch, copper, and the sharp, chemical reek of gunpowder. Her hands were tangled in Beatrice's pearl necklace. Chloe. A hand gripped her shoulder. It wasn't the heavy, clamping grip Gabriel had used on her weeks ago. It was frantic. Chloe opened her eyes. The floor was covered in shattered porcelain and wood splinters. She rolled off Beatrice, gasping for air. Gabriel was kneeling beside them. His gun was lowered, but still in his hand. His chest heaved. The flat, dead look in his grey eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. He didn't check himself. He grabbed his mother's arms, running his hands over her shoulders, her face, checking for blood. Beatrice was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but she nodded frantically. "I am okay," she signed, her hands shaking violently. "I am fine." Gabriel let out a ragged curse, resting his forehead against his mother's shoulder for a fraction of a second. Then he turned to Chloe. She was sitting up against the base of the table. A sharp piece of wood from the shattered chair back had grazed her cheek, leaving a slow trickle of blood trailing down to her jaw. Her cheap waitress uniform was covered in dust and scotch. Gabriel dropped his gun on the table. It made a heavy, definitive clatter. He moved toward her, his large frame blocking out the light from the hallway. He knelt directly in front of her. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping the blood from her jawline. His hand was shaking. Gabriel Costello's hand was shaking. "You covered her," Gabriel said. His voice was a rasp, completely stripped of its usual authority. She couldn't hear it. Chloe whispered, her vocal cords tight with adrenaline. She didn't know. Gabriel stared at her. The air between them was thick with gunpowder and a sudden violent shift in gravity. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He wasn't looking at a convenient translator. He was looking at the woman who had just thrown her body between his mother and a 12-gauge shotgun. "You're bleeding," he said softly. "It's just a scratch." Chloe deflected, trying to pull back, suddenly terrified of the intense, possessive heat radiating from him. Gabriel's hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the messy bun at the nape of her neck. He held her there, anchoring her, his thumb pressing lightly against her racing pulse. "Nobody touches my family," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying vow that vibrated in the quiet room. He held her gaze, the implication heavy, suffocating, and absolute. "And nobody touches you. Not anymore." Chloe's breath caught. She looked into his eyes and realized the terrible truth. The translation gig was over. She hadn't just saved Beatrice, she had inadvertently cemented herself into the foundation of Gabriel's world. And the Mafia boss didn't let go of things that belonged to him. Morning arrived not with the scream of garbage trucks outside her cheap studio, but with the suffocating silence of triple-paned glass. Chloe woke up in a bed that cost more than her college tuition. The sheets felt like liquid silk against her bruised skin. She hated them instantly. She sat up, her ribs aching where she had slammed into the floorboards of the restaurant 3 days ago. Her canvas tote bag sat on a velvet armchair in the corner. Next to it was a stack of brand-new clothes, cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers, silk blouses. None of it belonged to her, yet all of it was exactly her size. Gabriel hadn't asked if she wanted to move into the estate. He had simply carried her to his armored SUV while the police sirens wailed in the distance, his hands smeared with the blood of the man he'd just killed. When she tried to protest, to demand he take her home, he had looked at her with eyes so devoid of light she felt her throat close. "Your apartment is a glass box. They know who you are now. You stay here." She walked to the adjoining bathroom. The marble floor was shockingly cold against her bare feet. She stared at her reflection in the vast, fogless mirror. The scratch on her cheek had scabbed over, a thin red line bisecting her pale skin. She looked tired. She looked bored. Downstairs the house smelled of dark roast coffee and tension. Chloe found Beatrice in the kitchen. The older woman was sitting at an island counter the size of a small boat, staring blankly at a bowl of oatmeal. 2 massive men in dark suits stood by the patio doors. They didn't look at Chloe, but she felt the weight of their peripheral vision. Chloe walked over and sat on the stool next to Beatrice. She gently tapped the marble counter to announce her presence. Beatrice flinched, her shoulders jerking upward before she turned. The bags under her eyes were bruised purple. When she saw Chloe, a ragged sigh escaped her lips. "You are awake." Beatrice signed, her hands moving with a sluggish, heavy rhythm. "He wouldn't let me wake you." "I'm fine." Chloe signed back, forcing a small smile. "Just sore. How did you sleep?" Beatrice looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the ceramic bowl. "I keep feeling the floor shake. Every time a door closes, the floor shakes. I didn't hear the gun, Chloe. I only felt the wood break. I am a liability to him." Chloe's chest tightened. She reached out, covering Beatrice's cold, papery hands with her own. "You are his mother," Chloe signed, making her movements sharp and deliberate. "You are the only thing in his life that isn't a transaction. Do not say you are a liability." A heavy footstep sounded against the hardwood floor of the hallway. Gabriel walked into the kitchen. He was wearing a dark grey Henley, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. There was a raw, violent energy rolling off him, smelling faintly of ozone and stale adrenaline. He bypassed the coffee machine and walked straight to where Chloe sat. He stopped inches from her stool. The sheer mass of him blocked out the morning sun streaming through the windows. "Did you sleep?" Gabriel asked. His voice was a gravelly rasp. "I slept," Chloe said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I want my clothes, Gabriel. The ones in my apartment." "They're gone," he stated flatly. "The apartment is gone. I bought out your lease. My guys cleared it yesterday. The boxes are in storage." Chloe stared at him, a hot spike of fury piercing the fog of her exhaustion. "You can't do that. You can't just erase my life because someone tried to shoot you. They tried to shoot my mother," Gabriel corrected, leaning closer. The smell of his cedar cologne was entirely overwhelmed by the scent of cold sweat. "And you got in the way. That makes you a target. I don't leave targets walking around in the open. You wear the clothes upstairs, or you wear the uniform you bled in. It's your choice." Chloe gripped the edge of the marble counter. Her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream at him, to slap the arrogant, dictatorial look off his exhausted face. But then she looked past him and saw Beatrice watching them. The older woman was gripping the edge of her stool, her eyes wide, sensing the aggressive vibration of Gabriel's voice, though she couldn't hear the words. Chloe swallowed the bile in her throat. She looked Gabriel dead in the eye. "Tell her good morning," Chloe ordered. Gabriel blinked, momentarily derailed by the shift in her tone. "What?" "Tell your mother good morning. In her language." Chloe didn't break eye contact. "You don't get to lock me in a fortress, erase my life, and then ignore the woman I took a bullet for. Tell her." A muscle feathered rapidly in Gabriel's jaw. The two guards by the patio doors suddenly found the floor tiles incredibly interesting. Gabriel stared at Chloe, a dangerous, evaluating silence stretching between them. Then, slowly, he turned his head to look at Beatrice. He raised his right hand, bringing his fingers to his chin. He pulled his hand forward, then brought his left hand up, letting his right hand fall into the crook of his left elbow, raising it slightly like the sun coming up. "Good morning." His movements were rigid, utterly lacking grace, but the intent was unmistakable. Beatrice's breath hitched. A watery, fragile smile broke through the terror on her face. "Good morning, my son." She signed back. Gabriel dropped his hands. He looked back at Chloe. There was no victory in his eyes, just a grim, crushing reality. "Eat your breakfast, Chloe," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "We have a contractor coming to reinforce the perimeter at noon. Stay away from the windows." He walked out of the kitchen. Chloe watched his broad shoulders disappear down the hallway. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that the lock on her cage wasn't made of iron or threats. It was made of the terrifying, fragile humanity she had just forced out of him. 2 weeks blurred into a monotonous, high-definition paranoia. Chloe learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Tuesdays were cash-counting days in the basement, smelling distinctly of dirty paper and ink. She learned that Gabriel never slept more than 3 hours at a time, often pacing the library above her bedroom, his heavy footsteps a metronome in the dark. She also learned that Gabriel was studying ASL. She caught him one afternoon in his study. The heavy mahogany door was cracked open. He was sitting at his desk, staring at a laptop screen, violently repeating a gesture with his hands. He was trying to sign security. His thick, scarred fingers refused to cross and lock fluidly. He swore, a low, vicious sound, and slammed his fist onto the desk, rattling the expensive crystal decanter. Chloe had backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was trying. It terrified her more than his gun did. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday night. A storm was battering the coast, throwing sheets of rain against the reinforced glass of the estate. Chloe was in the kitchen, brewing chamomile tea for Beatrice, who was already asleep. The house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The back door connecting to the garage opened. It wasn't a smooth entry. The heavy metal door slammed against the wall, shaking the plaster. Chloe froze, the kettle in her hand. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the rack, her knuckles white. Gabriel stumbled into the kitchen. He looked like he had been dragged behind a car. His black suit jacket was shredded at the shoulder. His white shirt was soaked, clinging to him in heavy, dark patches. As he stepped into the overhead light, Chloe realized the patches weren't just rain. They were deep, arterial crimson. He was leaning heavily against the kitchen island, his breathing ragged and wet. He looked up, his grey eyes blown wide, pupils swallowed by darkness. When he saw her standing there with a frying pan, a grotesque, bloody smirk cracked his face. "Put the pan down, waitress," he ground out, coughing. A fine mist of red sprayed onto the pristine marble counter. "I'm not the one you need to hit tonight." Chloe dropped the skillet. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. She rushed toward him, the smell hitting her like a physical blow. It was copper, raw meat, and the sharp, acidic tang of burnt cordite. "Gabriel!" she gasped, her hands hovering over his chest, afraid to touch him and make it worse. "I need to call an ambulance. I need to get—" "No!" he snarled, grabbing her wrist with a hand slick with his own blood. His grip was weak, trembling. "No hospitals. They have a guy. Doc is on his way." His knees buckled. Chloe caught him, groaning under the sheer dead weight of him. She dragged him down to the floor, her silk pajamas instantly soaking up the cold blood from his shirt. Okay, you're on the floor." She panicked, pressing her hands frantically against his chest, trying to find the source of the bleeding. She ripped the buttons off his shirt. His left side was a mess of torn flesh and bruising. It wasn't a bullet hole. It looked like a deep, ragged slice from a blade, running from his ribs to his hip. Chloe stripped off her sweater, balling it up and pressing it violently against the wound. Gabriel roared in agony, his head thrashing back against the hardwood floor. His right hand shot out, blindly grabbing a fistful of her hair, pulling hard as his body arched against the pain. "Don't move," Chloe ordered, tears of sheer panic stinging her eyes. She leaned her entire body weight onto her hands, pressing the makeshift bandage down. "Doc is coming. Just breathe. Look at me, Gabriel, look at me." His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. He looked at her face, then down to her bloody hands pressing into his side. He let go of her hair. His bloody hand fell to the floor. Then slowly, with agonizing effort, he lifted his right hand. He brought his index finger up, tapping it weakly against his chin. "Who?" He was trying to sign. He was bleeding out on his kitchen floor, and his brain was misfiring, reverting to the language he'd been obsessively studying in secret. Chloe sobbed, a harsh, ugly sound. She shook her head. "No, Gabriel, stop, don't talk." He ignored her. He forced his hand to move again. He pointed at her. Then he brought his hand flat against his chest, moving it in a circular motion. "Please." It was the sign for please. But his face was contorted in a silent plea that went far beyond politeness. It was raw, naked desperation. "I'm here," Chloe whispered fiercely, leaning down until her forehead rested against his sweaty, cold shoulder. She kept the pressure on his wound. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving." He let out a long, shuddering breath, his hand dropping to the floor. "Good," he mumbled, his voice slurring. "Because if you run, I'll just have to come find you." He passed out before the back door opened, and 3 men carrying medical bags rushed in. Chloe sat against the kitchen cabinets for 2 hours while they stitched him back together. She watched the bloody gauze pile up on the pristine marble floor. She looked at her own hands, stained rust brown, drying tight against her skin. She felt a deep, sickening realization settle into her bones. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She was complicit. She had bandaged the monster. She had told him she wouldn't leave. The pure black and white morality she had clung to in her cheap apartment was gone, washed away in a tide of expensive silk and Gabriel's blood. She looked at his unconscious face on the floor. He looked so devastatingly human when he was broken. That was the trap. That was how the devil kept you. Not with fear, but with pity. 6 months later, the air inside Il Canto tasted exactly the same. Garlic, heavy cedar, and the sharp bite of expensive red wine. Chloe stood by the serving station outside the VIP room, holding a tray. She wasn't wearing a cheap uniform. She wore a tailored black dress that hit just below the knee, the fabric unforgivingly expensive. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist. A diamond stud caught the light in her right ear. She wasn't a waitress anymore. "They're ready for the main course?" Tony, the scarred lieutenant, said softly as he walked past her. He didn't look at her with the dismissive arrogance of the past. He gave a short, respectful nod, keeping his eyes on the floor. "Thank you, Tony," Chloe said. Her voice was steady, calm. It didn't shake. She pushed open the heavy mahogany doors. The VIP room was quiet. There were no 6 lieutenants arguing over shipments. There was only Gabriel and Beatrice. Gabriel sat at the head of the table. He wore a black suit, immaculate, though he moved slightly stiffer on his left side. The bruising under his eyes had faded, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. Beatrice sat to his right. She wore a bright crimson shawl and a smile that reached her eyes. When Chloe entered, they both turned. Chloe set the plates down. The seafood risotto, steaming and perfectly plated. She poured a glass of Barolo for Beatrice and a scotch for Gabriel. Gabriel watched her hands. He reached out and caught her wrist before she could pull away. His thumb brushed over the pulse point, a grounding, possessive gesture. He didn't look at the food. He looked at her. He let go of her wrist. Then Gabriel raised both of his hands. His movements were no longer stiff and agonizing. They were fluid, practiced, and deliberate. He had spent months drilling the muscle memory into his scarred knuckles, refusing to use an interpreter, refusing to let the gap between him and his family remain. "Sit with us." Gabriel signed. Chloe looked at him. The contradiction of the man still baffled her. He ordered violence with a whisper and commanded fear with a glance, yet he had spent hundreds of hours in silence, learning a language purely to bridge the isolation of two women. She looked at Beatrice. The older woman nodded emphatically, patting the empty chair next to her. "Sit," Beatrice signed, her eyes crinkling warmly. "He's paying for dinner." Chloe let out a soft laugh. It sounded right in this room now. It belonged here. She pulled out the chair and sat down. Gabriel picked up his glass of scotch. He didn't offer a toast to his men, or to his territory. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at Chloe. He raised his free hand. He touched his index finger to his chin, then pulled it down. True. Then he touched his chest, pulling his hand away in a fist. Mine. It wasn't standard ASL. It was a broken, clumsy adaptation. But the meaning was violently clear. True family. Mine. Beatrice raised her wine glass, tapping it gently against Gabriel's scotch glass. She didn't need to hear the clink to feel the resonance. Chloe looked at the two of them. She knew exactly what kind of world she was living in. She knew that outside these mahogany doors, men bled and bones broke to maintain the peace inside this room. She knew she had traded a quiet, innocent struggle for a loud, bloody compromise. But as Gabriel reached under the table, his heavy, warm hand settling firmly over her knee, anchoring her in the dark, she knew something else. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She had a voice. She had hands that could build bridges or tear down walls. And for the first time since Leo died, she wasn't afraid of the silence. She owned it. Chloe raised her water glass, meeting Gabriel's intense, slate-grey eyes. To us, she signed, her movements sharp and perfect. Gabriel smiled. It was a rare, dangerous thing, completely devoid of mercy for anyone outside that room, but filled with a terrifying devotion for the two women inside it. He nodded once, and in the profound, heavy quiet of the VIP room, they ate. Did Chloe make the right choice? Or did she trade her freedom for a gilded cage? The line between protector and captor is dangerously thin, and sometimes the only way to survive the dark is to hold the hand of the monster. If you loved this deep dive into the silent, chaotic world of Gabriel and Chloe, drop a like and let me know in the comments what you think about her decision. Don't forget to hit that share button and subscribe for more raw, intense storytelling. More stories are waiting in the shadows. See you next time!